My next job is to introduce somebody who really doesn't need an introduction to this audience, Harrison Schmitt, who is, of course, a former astronaut on Apollo 17. His distinguished career spanned, of course, many decades in different positions: geologist, an astronaut, a U.S. senator, and a professor. Began his career with the USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, as an astrogeologist in Flagstaff, Arizona. He was project chief for lunar field geological methods and participated in photo and telescopic mapping of the moon. Also, he instructed NASA astronauts during their geological field trips. Dr. Schmitt was selected later as a scientist astronaut by NASA in 1965 and was the backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 15 and was the lunar module pilot on Apollo 17, the last Apollo mission. And his first journey into space, that was, of course, in 1972. He was accompanied on that mission by Eugene Cernan and astronauts Cernan and Ronald Evans. In 1974, he assumed additional duties as NASA's chief of scientists and astronauts. Subsequently, was NASA's assistant administrator for energy programs. And after he left NASA in 1976, he was elected to the United States Senate from his home state of New Mexico and served in the Senate for 6 years. In 1994, he was appointed as an adjunct professor of engineering at the University of Wisconsin and chairman and president of the Annapolis Center for Environmental Quality. It's a great pleasure and an honor. We're very, very happy to have you here, to have Harrison Schmitt lecture.
Thank you. You attracted quite a crowd. Finally get to see everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. Let's have a little fun first with the usual. You got to be fast. Marty, Marty. These are little moon souvenirs. Liam, where are you? Oh, I don't know whether I can get it over there or not. Whoa! That was out of order. Ah! Well, anyway. Well, I want to first congratulate Robert Lightfoot and, of course, the entire NASA team that he has led so well in recent years. I want to remind everybody that that team kept alive the foundations for this return to the moon that we're talking about today. A remarkable accomplishment given the political environment that existed during that period of time. But what I would like to do is focus on how we get the job done now that President Trump and Vice President Pence have provided us with the policy directive in which the United States will, and I quote, will lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, followed by human missions to Mars and other destinations. That's a tall order, right? Tall order. Now, implementation of this policy for this country, and I think for the free world, is geopolitically crucial. It's critical that this be accomplished. This geopolitical imperative reaches at least to the national security level for the free world and for the United States that force rapid implementation of Apollo. Implementation will require a concentrated focus by the implementers. NASA's current plate of activities, I personally am afraid, prevents such a complete and unaltered focus. The question then arises, should NASA be radically reorganized, or should a new national space exploration agency be created? I prefer the former. Either way, the responsible agency should have the sole objective of implementation of the President's Space Policy Directive. The essential ingredients of implementation and the success of that implementation have been defined, I think, by the success of Apollo after considerable initial difficulties. Now, what was the recipe for this success? There was, of course, the geopolitical imperative, space leadership by America and the forces of freedom. There was a single-minded focus by NASA, a reservoir of young engineers and skilled workers who seemingly worked 16-hour days and 8-day weeks. As near as I could tell, that's what we were doing. There was the necessary base of technology that arose from World War II, from the Cold War, and of course, from many remarkable innovations by NASA and its industrial partners. There was presidential support through 4 administrations, particularly beginning with the Eisenhower administration and the bipartisan support of the Congress. Kennedy provided the articulate leadership to get things started. Johnson carried that on, and Nixon did not cancel it, as we saw in the previous administration. There were adequate management reserves, literally 100%. Some of you know that story. James Webb, the second administrator of NASA, asked his engineers, George Low and Chris Kraft and others, to give him an estimate of what it would take to put a man on the moon and return them safely to Earth. Those estimates came in those year dollars, around $8 billion. So Jim, in his infinite wisdom, doubled that when he talked to the Congress. That gave us the 100% reserve. We didn't know how to do this job at that time, but we at least knew we had the reserve to take care of those unknown unknowns, the unkunks that always arise and either are taken care of at the time or you slip schedule. In fact, the space shuttle almost didn't get to first launch as a consequence of that problem, but that's another story, the one which I dealt with in the United States Senate for a while. We had also tough, competent, disciplined, and courageous management, basically at all levels, that was able to keep going through the Apollo 1 fire, the Apollo 13 crisis, and all the political fears that were arising gradually, fears of failure. There was a minimally layered decision-making process. Literally, a good idea to correct a problem or enhance a mission could move rapidly to a decision, and I, in my own experience, saw that happen overnight on many occasions. There was a strong core of NASA engineering expertise. Doug remembers what that was like. That engineering expertise gave managers at least 2 options to consider when problems arose, one from industry and one from their own corps of engineers. There were strong, capable commercial contractor and supplier teams. But a very important qualification, NASA controlled development and manufacture of all items in the critical path to success. And I emphasize that, in the critical path to success. International participation in those early days was encouraged, but only for science experiments and lunar sample analysis. There was a working environment of liberty. You can't measure its importance, but I think it was extraordinarily important. Speaking up at any time, from preliminary design reviews, from critical design reviews, to tests, to simulation, and to flight operations. Because this new presidential initiative will span future generations, there are, however, several necessary additions beyond Apollo to the management environment that will be required to implement the new directive. The implementing agency must maintain an average age of less than about 30. You will note some ages there about 30. At the time of Apollo 13 crisis, Gene Kranz in Mission Control estimated that the average age of the engineers in Mission Control, and I think this extends to the entire 450,000 Americans and others that were working on Apollo, the average age was about 26 years. Anyone in here less than 26 years besides Liam? There we go. Well, when I talk to students in universities, I remind them that they're just about at that age and they better get to work. Now, the military, such as the nuclear navy, which is a good example, maintains that low age, average age. So a modification of civil service rules for national security programs has a long precedent. Realistic cost estimates with a significant management reserve, probably of about 30%, is also going to be needed. I say 30% rather than 100 because I think we're a little bit smarter. But those reserves should be carried at least through critical design review. And they need to be provided in the implementation budgets. Nothing destroys schedule more than an unknown unknown without a reserve to take care of it. These protect the milestones from unanticipated hardware and software challenges and those unknown unknowns, the unkunks that always appear. Now, the Space Council, the OMB, and Congress must advocate and protect those reserves. They are absolutely essential if we're going to continue political support for a program such as has been proposed. The traditional roles of the private sector in deep space exploration should continue. These are the roles of independent study and as prime contractors and suppliers of computational and hardware capabilities. They must meet the risk management requirements, however, demanded by a national program, but without undue emphasis on the potential adverse consequences of going forward. A new role of truly commercial entities, and I say truly commercial entities, would be to shoulder the load of space activities that are not directly related to a political commitment to deep space exploration. In addition to traditional roles in commercial satellite communications, these new activities would include, I think, terrestrial science, environmental monitoring, and space station supply. And I think the space station supply should continue indefinitely. We'll just see how that goes. Commercial and private entities also may lead to planetary pioneering, planetary base supply, and space resource production and settlement. International participation should be encouraged relative to science and engineering payloads and experiments. However, no international hardware, in my opinion, software or approvals should be in the critical path to success. What needs to happen to guarantee the implementation of the President's Space Policy Directive? Well, we either transfer all unrelated NASA programs and projects to other relevant agencies and recreate the management efficiency, the management environment of the Apollo program, or we create a new agency to do that, modeled after NASA of 1969. As a note of proof that focus brings results, between September of 1968 and November of 1969, that's Apollo 7 through Apollo 12, beginning 50 years ago this year, NASA and its contractors and suppliers, and 450,000 young men and women, mostly in their 20s, launched a Saturn V class mission on the average of every 2 months. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
We have, again, a few minutes for questions, and would you like to start?
Jack, the current average age of a civil servant within the agency is 47 or 48. And so my question to you is, lacking the geopolitical imperative that I'm old enough to remember from the 60s, how does NASA or another agency recruit and retain the young people nowadays that seem to want instant gratification? I'd be interested in any thoughts you might have on that.
My first thought is that you won't have any problem doing that if you push forward and actually get this program going. My experience in the universities and the high schools is that the young people will flock to NASA. Talk to Bob Cabana about hiring people. He has young people clamoring to work for NASA. I asked him that specific question. How do you compete with SpaceX and Blue Origin and others? He said, I don't have a problem. As long as we're doing things, I don't have a problem. And as long as we're doing things successfully, I don't have a problem. So I don't think that's an issue. There will be some young people that will go off and do other things, but the reservoir of talent and enthusiasm and motivation, I don't think has changed very much over time, at least in the engineering community and the scientific communities that I've been working with over the last 45 years. Any other questions?
Yeah, Dr. Schmidt, thank you. Dr. Schmidt, we on? Thank you.
We're on.
Dr. Schmidt, Greg Redfern, WTOP Radio. Do you think there's any chance that China, with its aggressive moon mission program, could provide a possible geopolitical focus, or do you think they'll come along and become an international partner? And thank you very much, sir, for your service and your missions.
Well, thank you. And that is the geopolitical imperative about which I speak. Primarily China. Everything that I'm aware of, and I hope there are people in this town aware of a lot more than I'm aware of, indicates that the situation right now is very comparable to the one that we faced in 1960 and 61. By the way, I don't know how many of you are aware, and the reason I included Eisenhower in this is because he was president at the time of the formation of NASA, with great bipartisan support from Lyndon Johnson in the Senate and McCormick in the House and others. He also, in January of 1960, over a year before the Kennedy challenge was issued, he wrote to Keith Glennon, the administrator of NASA at the time, a personal memo or letter ordering the accelerated development of the super booster. That became the Saturn V. That gave us a full over a year lead on the absolute critical enabling technology for doing what we did in that period of time. And Ike deserves all the credit in the world for having gotten that program started.
Dan?
How tolerant do you think society is today of risk compared to the way it was 50 years ago?
Well, there are indications it's less tolerant. It's certainly political. The political world is less tolerant, I think. I think that's safe to say. But again, I think that it has to do with implementation, and that if you're being successful, the tolerance for risk increases. That's absolutely, I think, clear. Now, we saw with the Apollo 1 fire, what some of us inside call the 204 fire, with the Apollo 1 fire, with the Apollo 13 crisis, we saw an erosion of risk tolerance in the Congress, and certainly in the White Houses of that time. And so we began to see cancellation of the later missions. 3 of the Apollo originally planned missions were not flown. However, I don't think that was as critical as the fact that beginning the Johnson administration, no less, even before Neil landed on the moon, we limited the buy of Saturn V's to 15. That was a mistake. This future program has to keep the SLS or whatever launch vehicle is being planned for the implementation of this program as a long-term, indefinite production, one that can be modernized and upgraded with time as new technologies come on, but you need to have that capability in the country, in the world, really, to continue these kinds of activities. One thing I would remind you of, that during the Apollo period, say from about late 1968 through 1972, we did have the capability for planetary protection. It was called a Saturn V. And if you want to have that capability indefinitely, you need to maintain the industrial base to build these very large rockets capable of 50 to 100 metric tons to trans-lunar injection.
Are we planning to live on the moon?
Oh, I hope we're planning to live on the moon. All the resources are there to do that. And as far as I can see, and I've been looking at this for a long time, you and your colleagues can certainly anticipate that this is possible. Now, whether or not we make it possible is our problem right now, but keeping the pressure on us is your problem.
Thank you. I have one quick question.
Surely.
The reserves and Congress. Congress is different. It's organized differently than it was when you served. Do you think that the Congress and the political establishment can be convinced to put extra money in to provide those reserves, given our budget and other situations today, if we really move forward with a program such as what you described?
Well, I think that the Congress is part of the issue, but I think it's also a major issue within the administration. The Congress, I think, does respond to leadership, the leadership and particularly leadership from the White House. And if this program is to be implemented, the White House, the President and the Vice President, as well as the Office of Management and Budget, are going to have to realize that the success of the program is dependent on having management reserves. The political success as well as the technical success. And so I personally think that it's possible to do that, but you have to have the leadership. If you go back to the days of the Constellation program, one of the primary failures of Constellation was, as Bob Lightfoot has talked about, was a failure to build the momentum so that it could survive the change of administration. And that happened because of approximately $11 billion being cut from the original requirements for the Constellation program. And you could not maintain schedules when you have those kind of cuts. That was a negative reserve that was happening. So it just accelerated the failure of meeting milestones. And so that experience should tell this administration, I hope it tells this administration, Scott, Pace, are you still here? Tells this administration that the pressure has to be to avoid the natural tendency of the OMB to cut the budgets and to take out those reserves as a way of improving your efficiency ratings or whatever they give in the Office of Management and Budget. That is absolutely critical. If you don't have those reserves, this program is going to fail. Because we know there will be things we don't expect. That much we know. We don't know what they are, but we know they'll be there. And the only way you handle it is to have these reserves ready for use and implementation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Now I want to call Jeff and Robert back up, and we have a special presentation for Harrison tonight.
On March 12th last, USRA turned 49, and of course this summer we will celebrate the 49th anniversary of the first human landing on the moon. So as we enter our 50th year, we wanted to commemorate your contributions to space exploration, to include your service as the founding director of our Division of Space Biomedicine back in 1984, with this small token of our appreciation. And of course, this is a lunar globe. It's based on NASA digital terrain data. And on its surface, we have, if somebody can help me find it, unless I get my glasses on, we have identified the landing site of Apollo 17, which I would, of course, ask you to verify, because who would know better?
That's fantastic. Serena taught us. He even got a red mark to help me out. Very good.
And I wanted to read the inscription, if I may, at the base. Astronaut Harrison H. Schmitt, Apollo 17 lunar module pilot, in commemoration of your service to the United States of America and all humankind.
As I stated earlier, a lot of us in my generation stand on your shoulders and all your colleagues. And all we can do is make you proud for what you did here as we move forward toward going back to the moon. And hope you get to see that and celebrate it with us. Thank you for your service, and thanks for everything you've done for us.
Thank you so much. This is unexpected and a great privilege, and only accepted on the behalf of so many that made all of this possible and continue to do so with the LRO and the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and many other activities that are ongoing. If you haven't visited Marshall Space Flight Center to see what's going on, or the Cape to see what's going on with the SLS, you should. It's a magnificent project, and I have been assured its growth potential is to 100 metric tons to lunar insertion. I also want to, though, congratulate the USRA. I don't know how many of you in this room were at the first Lunar Science Conference. Raise your hand if you were. Believe me, you should go to the successor conferences, now called the Lunar and Planetary Conferences, at every opportunity. And you'll see what the investment, the scientific investment in Apollo has resulted in. It is, as so many of us have said, the gift that keeps on giving. Where it's being funded, I don't know, and I don't ask, but the amount of information that is coming out of the lunar samples, the observations and the data that resulted from the Apollo missions, setting aside its geopolitical significance, is absolutely extraordinary. You're going to hear some more about it here in a few moments, but you should try to visit and pay your registration fee at the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference. It really, and USRA has been the mainstay of that program and of the continuation of many of the scientific activities that are ongoing. It was a great pleasure for me to try to help out a little bit on the biomedical side of things, another area of great interest to me, and one which is going to be critical, as has already been mentioned, to our success in going to Mars and exploring that particular body in the universe. Thank you so much.